Is that good enough? Okay. I'm used to some other buildings on campus. So, thanks to Joe Elder and our colleagues here for organizing this, and also thank you very much to the sponsors of this event. And I don't think I'm going to be as eloquent as Joe. I'm glad he was very systematic in covering certain things. I want to have some maps ready and then go into just several issues very, very briefly. And so this is the kind of map, if you go to the CIA World Fact Book, which is obviously not a classified document. I recommend it to my students all the time. It has these generic maps, and I like to point out in talking about Iraq, for example, that it shows Iraq as something very homogeneous, and if you look at this kind of map for Afghanistan, it also looks like a very idyllic, homogeneous kind of place. Now, one of the interesting things about the geography of Afghanistan is that actually it's this kind of barrier between the north and the south. There are only several spots where you can traverse the area going from, let's say, Central Asia down to India or vice versa. And so there are things like the Khyber Pass or the Habak Pass and a few others. There have been some tunnels that were built in the 20th century. So basically the first point here is that the country is deeply divided by these massive mountains, and that's one of the actually important facts relevant for one or two of the things I'm going to say today. This particular map, well, this is one of the other maps that indicates some of the regions in Afghanistan. I should remind myself to look here. And so the area in the north, the northern part, is going to be the area that used to be called like the Northern Alliance, Uzbeks and Turkmen and Hazaras, who were originally descended from Mongols, and Persian speakers, so Dari speakers. Those people were considered to be kind of sort of the moderates in, or the liberal types in Afghanistan. And in the southern part, that's where you have the heavy Pashto zone that has the co-ethnics over on the Pakistani side. My maps are not ideal, but this one will show that, you know, the kind of orangey, reddish, bluish types in the north are ethnically very distinct from the greenish parts in the south, and that's what goes over into Pakistan. And this is just another one, another map showing the ethno-linguistic groups. Now, I'd like to focus on, since time is limited and we'd like to have time for discussion and response to questions, I'd just like to focus on several points. And I, very strategically left all the original materials with my book bag in my car so that I don't hurt my back carrying too many bags. But thankfully, I have decent quotations here in the slides. And so one of the things that I found, actually one of the things that I came across, this article that I think I read when it was first published, recently I saw Zbigniew Brzezinski on several shows. I think I caught him actually on the Rachel Maddow show, but he's been doing the circuit recently. And he's also been talking about the trap that the United States had kind of set in Afghanistan when the Soviets went into Afghanistan, when they invaded it shortly before midnight on December 24, 1979. So this was kind of a trap that the United States had set. And so this was a real problem for the Soviet Union. Over the course of the 1980s, the United States was very deeply involved in creating an Islamic-based resistance, an anti-colonial, anti-Soviet, anti-religious resistance. And so some of you may recall that for President Reagan, the Mujahideen were freedom fighters. And of course, there's a very sad trajectory over how Mujahideen have gone from being freedom fighters to today being kind of Islamic terrorists and so on. So this is a really interesting article. So in the New York Times, well, actually I came across this because I was trying to verify trying to find more information about Soviet troop strength in Afghanistan. And actually by now I've understood that there are various estimates that go from 140, Zbigniew Brzezinski said 260 or 270,000, and I've even seen numbers like 500, 600,000. But I'll stick with this article. Now this article is an interview with somebody who was the KGB station chief. in Kabul for much of the 1970s. And he himself is of mixed Tatar and Uzbek background. And of course, since I'm of Tatar background, I say, okay, I'm going to use this guy. And so it's really interesting in the article, and I have 3 slides of quotations. It's, you know, if my dear friend Milan Hauner were here, he might maybe have some opinion about whether this is somebody that we can rely on or not rely on. But I found that many of his ideas mesh with my own ideas about what the implications are of the United States being involved in Afghanistan and what the prospects are for success. So let's just look at some of the things he said. So first, and again, thankfully I have all of this material here, otherwise I'd be running to the car. So he says in this interview that the Americans have already made the same mistakes that the Soviets have made, but they are also making their own mistakes, and we haven't copyrighted them, and we're not to blame for those. And so the second point that he's making is that the Americans underestimated the resistance and that the opposition grew up in the countryside outside of Kabul. And so the Soviets entrenched themselves in Kabul and in the major cities. They really weren't too worried about the countryside, and it's really in the countryside where you had this, you know, tremendous resistance that came up and then took over the country, and we're seeing that again. And there's always, you know, I think people who work on the history of Afghanistan use the line that the king of Afghanistan, or now the president of Afghanistan, is nothing really more than the mayor of Kabul. And in fact, you know, you might recall during the electoral campaign that Hamid Karzai basically touched down in one place with a helicopter and then pretty much had to just, you know, go away because it wasn't in Kabul and he was received not very, very well. Okay, and so this touches a little bit on what Joe said too. The next point is about the wider failure to understand the irritative allergy among Afghans to foreign occupation, one that every invading power since the British in the 1840s has come to rule. And so I would definitely agree with Joe. I mean, me personally, you know, I think that if the United States was attacked by Al-Qaeda, they were based in Afghanistan, I understood the necessity of having the word surgical strike has bad connotation, but you know, trying to remove Al-Qaeda surgically. Of course, we haven't done that. We haven't been successful in that. But you know, there's the question of, you know, defining the enemy, who the enemy are, and so on. And unfortunately, the United States, since the invasion of Afghanistan after 9/11/2001, has of course not removed Al-Qaeda. It's not taken out Osama bin Laden, and so on. And the kinds of tactics we've used over, you know, 8 years more or less means that we've actually already worn out our welcome. And the kinds of tactics that the United States is using is related to what this Mr. Kabulov is saying. So he says one of our mistakes was staying instead of leaving. After we changed the regime, we should have handed over and said goodbye, but we didn't, and the Americans, oops, typo, and the Americans haven't either. Now, confronted by an elusive insurgency and unable to maintain a presence in the hinterland because of the lack of troops, the Soviets, like the Americans, resorted to an over-reliance on heavy weapons, especially air power. We abused human rights, including the use of aggressive bombardment. They used the term, like one of the terms that's used in the English language literature is rubblization, not throwing rubles at them, but turning everything into rubble. And now it's the same, absolutely the same, says Mr. Kabulov. And so, you know, basically, you know, there's even, I've even seen like Soviet films about the, you know, about the war in Afghanistan and the helicopters coming up and just sending their rockets and everything like that. And so, in a way, the United States, as it has been doing in recent decades, you know, believes that air power can take care of everything. We're sending missiles, you know, so yes, we got the terrorists, 30, 40 people in the wedding party, you know, we don't really worry about that. But basically, in terms of my reading, in terms of my understanding, popular sentiment has been rising against the United States, and the Afghan population increasingly does not want the United States to be there. And as a footnote to something Joe said, you know, obviously once President Obama was inaugurated, you know, very soon after, the drone attacks on Pakistan resumed as well. And just 1 or 2 days ago, I think I heard on BBC that now some of the Taliban groups in Pakistan have decided to unite against the Americans because of the attacks that are going on from air. Okay, now when I teach about, in my course on Central Asia, we have kind of a module on Afghanistan, and because of everything that's been going on in the world in the past decade. And so one of the things that students get to read about is what the Soviet program was. Now, there are many things that I absolutely don't support about the Soviet Union, and that's in part because of my upbringing in a very strongly anti-Soviet family. Since I'm from that part, my ancestry is from that part of the world. But when you read about some of the kinds of things like, you know, redistribution of land and education, more rights for women and so on, you know, who can disagree, you know, with most of that or all of that? And so, according to Mr. Kabulov, who again was the former KGB station chief in Kabul, so the modernizing mission Moscow pursued from the 1950s on with billions of rubles spent on education, advanced the role of women and building roads, dams, and an industrial infrastructure. Where, I ask, are the big American projects to match those? I'll tell you, there aren't any. American generals have avoided contact with him. So basically, this, you know, for whatever reason, he seems radioactive. And he's saying that the Soviets had these huge projects, and actually, you know, this is one of those instances where I would say that if the United States is going to wage anything in Afghanistan, it should be waging peace in terms of helping to build an infrastructure, building schools, you know, and so on. Yes, I want to continue. Okay, so just for this part, and then I have one shorter section. So basically, so we should remind ourselves, the Soviet invasion began in 1979. By 1987, Soviet troops reached their peak strength of 140,000 troops. Soviet troops withdrew in defeat in February 1989, and I think they were willing to fight a much dirtier fight than the United States is prepared to fight. And so, you know, we're not talking about the United States having 100,000 or 150,000 or 200,000 troops. You know, basically with this latest surge of I actually don't have the number off the tip of my tongue, but basically it's like 70,000, 80,000, that would all raise it to. So that's a big problem. One or two quick points, and then I'll try to conclude. The other thing, Joe mentioned opium. There was a very, very depressing article in the New York Times Magazine on July 27, 2008, and basically the title is, you know, is Afghanistan a narco state? And obviously one of the things about Afghanistan is that, you know, you have these record-breaking yields of opium production there. And one of the memorable lines for me in this article was that the Karzai administration has been playing the United States like a fiddle. And so, you know, if we're trying to promote democracy, if we're trying to promote all kinds of other things, you know, what if actually we've been had this whole time? I don't know. That's worth just kind of mentioning. Okay, the last point that I want to focus on is, and that better not be my battery going. The last thing I'd like to focus on is the northern perspective. And this is, the way I liken it, what I describe this as is that Vladimir Putin or Medvedev, depending on who you think is in charge in Russia, suddenly said, check. And I don't think Barack Obama realized he was actually in a chess game with Russia. And so some very, very interesting things have happened recently since mid-February. Namely, that out of the blue, that Kyrgyzstan, where we have the Manas Air Base, announced an agreement for financial assistance from Russia. And they said basically that the United States would have to stop using the Manas Air Base in Kyrgyzstan. Formerly, following 9/11, we had a kind of unholy alliance with Uzbekistan. There was the Khanabad Air Base we used to use. Eventually, because of criticism of the very horrible human rights situation in Uzbekistan, Uzbekistan forced the United States to leave, and we've abandoned use of that air base. But we've been relying on the Manas airfield in Kyrgyzstan for transporting personnel. And so, you know, one of the interesting questions is if we're, and by the way, just today, for good measure, Kyrgyzstan said, oh, and by the way, all you Europeans, you have to leave too. So actually, NATO's not going to be able to use that at all. So this leaves the United States in a very, very interesting situation. So if we're going to pursue a war that I think we don't want the United States to pursue, but if the United States, the Barack Obama administration, is going to be pursuing that kind of war, how are you going to continue to supply the troops you already have? And how are you going to bring fresh troops, additional troops, your new surge for Afghanistan? And how are you going to supply them too? One of the few routes to getting to Afghanistan would be the Khyber Pass. The bridge over the Khyber Pass was blown up quite recently. The Khanabad Air Base was shut down. We're going to have to stop using the Manas airfield in about 6 months or so. And so basically, I don't have a laser pointer, but basically, suddenly the United States is very strongly reliant either on an airlift which is not impossible, but it's very, expensive. We're either going to have to airlift everything into Afghanistan, including heavy machinery and including, who knows, just even drinking water, or we're going to have to rely on new understandings with Moscow and with Tashkent, and to go overland, so through Russia. In fact, the first trainload of material got that far through Russia today. But to go through Russia, to go through Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, over the same bridge in Termez through which the Soviets withdrew in 1989 and then later on. So basically, if anything, the United States is more vulnerable now in terms of its position, in terms of maintaining its troops, in terms of supplying its troops. And so this is just a summary of the four things. So the Manas Air Base, there's the Hanabad Air Base, both of those are closed. There's the bridge over the Panj River, and the Khyber Pass, and there's others. But one of the interesting things, Russia is one of those places I follow as well, and I read a lot about. But be it Dmitry Medvedev or especially Vladimir Putin, they actually want the United States to fail in Afghanistan. And so in a way, I would close by saying that if Zbigniew Brzezinski is willing to admit that the United States set a trap for the Soviet Union into which it walked and then left Afghanistan in defeat, I actually think that Russia is setting the same kind of trap in a way for the United States, and the United States is walking into it. And so I'm very, very concerned that even if the United States tries to make a deeper commitment in Afghanistan, it will find that it's basically cut off, it has its legs cut off or other parts cut off. So I think it's a very, very dangerous situation, which is why, I think Mr. Kabulov's advice isn't so bad. After regime change, they should have left, and probably we should leave too. Thank you.